Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Brockport, New York, September 29th, 2012. Inside SUNY Brockport's McLean Hall, the night is quiet, until it isn't. Family can't reach 18-year-old freshman Alexandra Kogut. A 911 welfare request is logged. Campus police move fast. Within minutes, a routine check becomes a locked scene. This chapter keeps to the clock. 12:13 a.m. Alexandra posts what will be her last public tweet. After that, there's no outward social activity from her account. A dark interval begins. After 2:30 a.m., calls and texts from home go unanswered. Dispatch relays the welfare request to campus officers. The dorm's access controls and overnight staffing mean responders know exactly which floor to check and how to isolate a single room without disturbing an entire building. 2:50, 3 o'clock a.m. Controlled entry. Officers step through with body cams rolling and scene logs open. They secure the doorway, split responsibilities, and initiate a standard interior sweep. EMS is staged. The corridor is cleared of non-essential foot traffic. A single room is designated the primary locus. Everything else is held as perimeter. No campus-wide active threat alert is issued because early indicators point inward, not to a roaming assailant. 3:10, 3:20 a.m. The containment order extends to the immediate hallway and stairwell. A sergeant begins the first entry-exit log, names, badge numbers, times. A second officer starts the inventory of what can be seen without disturbing anything: positions of furniture, light switches, windows closed or open, ambient temperature. A third manages communications with dispatch and residence life staff to freeze access logs and camera pulls before they roll over at shift change. 3:30 a.m. The chain of custody envelope system is set up on a folding table outside the door. Evidence markers remain in reserve. Nothing is tagged until the forensics team arrives. Family notification procedures are queued for the watch commander. The college's duty administrator readies a factual statement that won't compromise the investigation. Negative evidence matters here. There are no reliable ear-witness reports from residents about an assault in the narrow pre-dawn window, despite rooms nearby. In dorm investigations, silence isn't neutral, it's data. It narrows the window for impact sounds and limits the number of potential third-party observers. That silence will later be tested against door access reports, staff logs, and any ambient noise captures from nearby cameras. 3:45 a.m. The decision is made to treat the space as a homicide scene pending medical examiner findings. The building isn't evacuated. Residents on the affected floor are told to remain in their rooms while officers finish the initial canvass. 4:00 a.m. Separate patrol units coordinate with state police to check nearby interstate service areas for vehicles and persons linked to late-night campus visits. One contact will matter, but we're not there yet. In towns like Brockport, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The goal here is precision. Lock the timeline, freeze the environment, and preserve every comparison point for later: phone records, desk logs, security video, and what the medical examiner will call the body as seen. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. When everything points inward this early, investigators ask, is it because the evidence is strong, or because we're seeing only what survived the first hour? The secure handoff at McLean Hall closed one stage of the investigation and opened another. With the scene frozen, chain of custody protocol shifted the focus to the medical examiner's office. For law enforcement, the body itself becomes a second crime scene, an environment that can confirm or challenge everything suggested inside the dorm. Transport was executed under seal. EMS had already confirmed no chance of resuscitation, but the paperwork was precise. Time of removal logged, escorting officers identified, transport vehicle sealed with numbered tags. Each step mattered because every piece of physical evidence collected would later be compared against digital records and testimony. Jurors, years later, would look for consistency. So the first responsibility was accuracy. At intake, the examiner's team photographed Alexandra Kogut's body from multiple angles before any invasive procedure. Clothing was removed, labeled, and stored in separate paper bags to prevent cross-contamination. Fingernail clippings and scrapings were preserved in sterile envelopes. Swabs were taken from areas that might show transfer evidence. The initial inventory recorded bruising patterns across the face and upper body, a finding consistent with a violent assault using blunt force. At this stage, notes read preliminary. Nothing is considered proven until confirmed through autopsy. The autopsy began with external examination. The examiner documented contusions, lacerations, and thermal injuries that matched the possible use of a heated object. That raised the first significant forensic question. Were the burns defensive, inflicted while the victim tried to shield herself, or were they part of a continuous assault? Each injury was measured and photographed. Samples of tissue were collected for histology to determine if the burns occurred while the victim was still alive, a critical detail for later trial arguments. Internal examination confirmed severe blunt force trauma as the cause of death. Injuries to the skull and brain were consistent with repeated strikes delivered at close range. Toxicology was routine. Results showed no drugs or alcohol at levels that would impair awareness. This ruled out a potential defense claim that the victim had been incapacitated by her own condition. The examiner signed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. Classification: homicide. Chain of custody did not end at the autopsy table. Photographs, tissue slides, and preserved items were logged with barcodes. Custody forms followed each item, preventing later challenges in court that evidence had been mishandled. The significance was clear. Even a small gap could weaken the prosecution's ability to tie digital, testimonial, and physical findings together. One procedural anomaly stood out. Despite a violent assault, there was no indication of forced entry, no sign of a struggle extending beyond the immediate area of the room. Forensic staff noted that the injuries spoke to proximity and escalation within a confined space. That observation, while not conclusive on its own, aligned with the dorm logs suggesting limited access. For investigators, the morgue findings did two things. They narrowed the timeline. Injuries fit within the dark interval after Alexandra's final tweet, and they confirmed that no outside weapon had been procured beforehand. The implements used were already inside the dorm room. That fact would shape both charging theory and later courtroom arguments about intent. In towns like Brockport, murders aren't just crimes. They destabilize a sense of safety. A freshman's body arriving at the examiner's office was more than an isolated tragedy. It was a record of what happens when prevention fails. The examiner's report turned grief into documentation, something the justice system could use to answer the family's questions with facts. The dorm room at McLean Hall was treated as a contained environment. Technicians documented the threshold first: door hardware intact, strike plate unbent, latch functioning. That mattered. An intact lock narrowed the field to someone with legitimate access or someone already inside. The peephole, hinges, and door edge were photographed before anyone crossed the plane. Only then did they step in. Inside, the approach was slow and methodical, left to right, ceiling to floor, before anything was touched. Furniture positions were sketched and photographed. The desk held ordinary student items. Nothing suggested ransacking or theft. The closet doors were closed. Drawers looked undisturbed. Signs of struggle were confined to the sleeping area. Disturbed bedding, displaced pillow, and compression in the mattress that matched close quarters force rather than a prolonged chase through the room. The window was shut and latched from the inside. Itemization followed. A heat-bearing hair implement was found within reach of the bed. It was photographed in place, bagged with fresh gloves, and set aside for possible later comparison. Bedding and clothing were collected in separate paper bags, each labeled with time, collector, and location in the room. Technicians used alternate light sources to survey for transfer and traced a limited pattern in the immediate zone only. No broad smears down walls, no drag indicators out to the hall. Latent prints were dusted on smooth surfaces. Swabs were taken from the implement's handle and cord. A careful floor lift captured trace fibers near the bed frame. Nothing in the common area suggested a staged burglary or a third-party entry. While the evidence team worked, a separate detail locked down the building's movement history. Residents' life froze the electronic desk logs. Guest sign-in pages were photocopied, sealed, and removed. Security pulled the overnight camera feed from the lobby and outside entrances, preserving the raw stream before automatic overwrite. Those clips would later be cross-checked with key holder audits from resident assistants and the timestamps in dispatch records. The goal was to anchor every minute: who entered the lobby, who signed in, and whether anyone exited during the narrow window between the final tweet at 12:13 a.m. and the welfare check entry just before 3:00 a.m. Investigators also canvassed the hallway without breaking containment. Residents were interviewed at their doors. Most reported quiet. None provided a reliable time-stamped account of impact sounds. That silence reinforced what the room already implied: fast, close, and contained. It also kept the timeline tight for when the assault likely occurred. Outside campus, a parallel team coordinated with state police regarding a vehicle stop at the DeWitt service area. The vehicle itself was processed where policy allowed. Exterior photographed for condition, interior screened for visible transfer, and high-touch surfaces swabbed. Custody labels referenced both locations so defense could not claim confusion later. Whether those swabs would yield probative results was unknown in the moment. Preserving them was the point. By the end of the residence hall processing, the picture was consistent. No forced entry, no broad evidence of a third party or a staged burglary, an implement from the room bagged for later comparison, access records and cameras preserved before rollover. The timeline stayed narrow, the geography stayed simple. In cases like this, simplicity can be either clarity or a trap. One investigator put it plainly: the absence of noise doesn't prove intent, but it does remove excuses. From the sealed room, the focus shifts to clocks, cameras, and call detail, what can be proved minute by minute without guessing. Residents' Life froze the lobby sign-in sheets and handed over the overnight desk log. The entries confirmed a late evening guest signed in for Alexandra Kogut on September 28th. Security preserved the raw lobby camera stream and exterior entrance views before automatic overwrite. Technicians verified time codes against the dispatcher's clock so every frame could be aligned to the same reference. Traffic through the building was light. The feed showed routine student movement, then quiet. Nothing on those cameras suggested a roaming threat in the halls in the hours before officers arrived. On the victim's side of the ledger, outward social activity stopped at 12:13 a.m., her final public tweet. There were no additional posts from her accounts after that point. Investigators requested carrier records through proper legal process for devices linked to the room and for the registered visitor. In 2012, that meant call detail and tower routing, not GPS or app pings. The goal was simple: establish whether any phone left the Brockport area before first responders made entry, and if so, when. Analysts synchronized dispatch logs with any available call starts and tower handoffs to bracket movement without exceeding what the data could support. Dispatch audio and CAD entries added the other side of the timeline. The 911 welfare request was received in the early morning hours. The responding units acknowledged and arrived within minutes. Those timestamps now matched what security's cameras showed: officers entering the building, moving to the correct floor, and isolating a single room. This reconciliation is standard, but it matters. If a defense later claims the times are off, the record shows that multiple independent clocks agreed. After the room was secured, a parallel effort looked outward. Patrols coordinated with state police along the New York State Thruway, focusing on eastbound service areas reachable in the short window after campus quieted. Within hours, troopers located a vehicle and a male associated with the visit at the DeWitt service area. The stop time was recorded, identifiers were documented, and contact was relayed back to Monroe County. The vehicle wasn't impounded at the scene without a warrant decision. Instead, troopers preserved what policy allowed: photographs, basic condition notes, and high-touch swabs with chain of custody labels cross-referenced to the dorm scene. Analysts then did the slow work: desk log times compared to camera frames compared to dispatcher entries. Dispatcher entries compared to carrier records as they became available. The objective was to collapse any gaps that could be exploited later. If the tower routing suggested a device still in Brockport during the silent stretch after 12:13 a.m., that added weight to a contained timeline. If it showed movement east before officers reached McLean Hall, that supported the throughway stop as part of a continuous route rather than an unrelated coincidence. Where the records were silent, the silence was noted. Where two clocks disagreed, the dispatcher's reference time controlled. One line stayed in the working notes. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. When everything points to a narrow window, good practice is to test for the ordinary: time drift on cameras, missed lobby angles, or a late manual entry in a paper log. Each potential error source was checked and documented so the story of that night would not depend on a single machine's clock. This isn't about drama. It's about building a spine that won't crack under cross-examination. In a campus crime where the scene reads inward, digital movement provides the contrast. Who entered, who stayed, who left, and when. With the digital map set, the next step is to measure stories against it. With the clocks aligned and the route mapped, investigators turned to what people said and whether any of it could survive the records. At the DeWitt service area, troopers documented identifiers, secured basic swabs where policy allowed, and transported the weekend visitor to a controlled room for questioning. The recording system captured time in, time out, who was present, and a rights advisement. He agreed to speak. The tone stayed measured. The questions were built around fixed points the team could already prove. Arrival in Brockport, the silent window after 12:13 a.m., the welfare check, and the eastbound contact within hours. Early in the session, the interview became a statement. According to police reports and later court filings, the visitor admitted he intentionally killed 18-year-old Alexandra Kogut in the dorm room at SUNY Brockport. The admission was not the end of the process. It was the beginning of verification. Investigators asked for sequence, position in the room, instruments used, and what happened immediately after. He referenced his hands and an item consistent with a heated hair implement. Those details matched the morgue findings and the itemized collection list from McLean Hall, allowing the team to mark the core elements as confirmed rather than working. Once a statement like that is in play, the checklist expands. Was the suspect properly advised? Was there any promise of benefit or threat? Was the interview length reasonable? The breaks logged, water offered, restroom access given? Supervisors reviewed the custody log in real time and again afterward to ensure the recording and paperwork aligned. A clean record matters when a defense argues stress, fatigue, or misunderstanding. The state's answer is a clock, a camera, and a form. The content of the interview was tested against the digital timeline. He said the assault happened in the early morning hours. On the record side, outward social activity from Alexandra ceased at 12:13 a.m. The dorm stayed quiet, and officers entered just before 3 o'clock a.m. He said he left quickly and drove east on the thruway. Troopers documented the DeWitt contact within hours, consistent with that route. He did not claim a third person entered the room. He did not describe forced entry. Those omissions were as important as the admissions. They dovetailed with the intact door hardware, the locked window, and the absence of ransack in the common area. Later, defense counsel raised extreme emotional disturbance, a recognized legal theory in New York that can reduce culpability if accepted by a jury. That is not a fact about what happened. It is an interpretation of why. Investigators treated it accordingly. They pulled any available prior communications, looked for documented conflict or reconciliation plans around that weekend, and flagged messages that might be introduced at trial to contextualize mood or intent. Where messages existed, they were preserved in original format with metadata. Where they did not, the absence was noted as negative evidence rather than speculated on. One inconsistency surfaced during review. The time the suspect first said he decided to leave campus did not align perfectly with the desk log and camera frames. It wasn't a dramatic gap. It was minutes, but minutes mattered. Analysts replayed the lobby footage, confirmed time code against dispatch, and updated the comparison chart so the state wouldn't walk into cross-examination with an avoidable discrepancy. If a defense expert later argued that the interview showed uncertainty about times, the rebuttal would be simple. 3 independent clocks agreed on entry, response, and the DeWitt contact. A 911 recording tied to later proceedings added one more layer of context to the suspect's narrative. Where his phrasing suggested remorse, the audio fixed when and how he described the assault relative to his stop on the thruway. The words were logged, but the timestamps were the weight-bearing part. In court, phrasing is debated. Clocks are not. No interview stands alone. It lives or dies next to the body as seen findings, the room processing, and the digital backbone. Here, the admission, the instrument details, and the route east matched what the evidence already showed. The remaining questions were about intent and legal framing, not identity or presence. A campus crime can feel abstract until a voice says, "I did it." Even then, the job is to separate emotion from proof. The proof here survived the comparison. With a recorded statement on file and the digital map stabilized, detectives tested a narrow question. Was anything bought, prepared, or staged that would signal advanced planning? Financial analysts pulled bank and card activity for the victim and the weekend visitor spanning the late hours of September 28th into the morning of September 29th. Subpoenas covered debit, credit, and ATM data. Where accounts were shared or family-funded, those institutions were notified for limited time-bound records. The review looked for obvious markers, purchases of striking tools, restraints, or anything that would function as a weapon. Nothing in that window showed specialized procurement tied to the assault. Investigators also screened campus card activity for vending or retail runs close to the silent interval after 12:13 a.m. There was no transaction that altered the established timeline. Surveillance complements receipts. Retail cameras near campus and on likely departure routes were requested for those same hours. The objective wasn't a full travelogue, it was a yes or no. Did anyone make a pre-assault store stop compatible with weapon acquisition? The answer stayed negative. Across the room, processing and the morgue report, the implements were already inside McLean Hall, hands and a heat-bearing hair device, placing the emphasis on opportunity rather than tools gathered elsewhere. Time of death brackets were checked against this procurement sweep. The medical examiner's window, anchored by injury patterning and scene conditions, fit squarely between Alexandra Kogat's final public tweet at 12:13 a.m. and the welfare check entry just before 3 o'clock a.m. Nothing in the financial or surveillance work cracked that bracket open. No late-night purchase created a new timestamp. No receipt placed the suspect away from the dorm during the assault interval. In a courtroom, absence is not proof, but aligned absences across systems carry weight. Travel indicators were handled with the same restraint. The New York State Thruway Corridor offers limited documentation. A service area presence can be logged. Toll crossings may or may not create electronic traces depending on payment method in 2012. Patrol contacts certainly do. What investigators could prove is what they used. Troopers documented the DeWitt service area contact within hours of campus officers securing McLean Hall. Where a toll record or a fuel receipt existed, it was preserved. Where a cash payment left no electronic trail, that gap was noted as negative evidence rather than speculated into narrative. Medical considerations were equally practical. Intake photos and notes from the post-stop custody log recorded the suspect's physical condition as observed. No hospital visit occurred before the interview, and no emergent care was requested. The point wasn't to dramatize, it was to fix a baseline, so later claims of incapacitation could be tested against contemporaneous observations. Planning, in law, is often read through what a person brings with them. Here, the collections list and autopsy confirmation pointed to implements within arm's reach of the bed. That does not answer why the assault began. It does shape how prosecutors think about intent. The file did not show a late-night weapon purchase, a special trip for gear, or messages arranging a violent confrontation. What it showed was the speed of escalation inside a dorm room and a departure east within hours. The difference matters. Plans leave receipts. Impulse leaves reach. Prosecutors also weighed the short set of post-assault actions. The drive to DeWitt, the early contact with law enforcement, and the recorded statement formed a sequence that would later be argued from both sides. For charging, though, the question remains straightforward. Do the physical findings, the digital backbone, and the statements support an intentional homicide count under New York law? With procurement eliminated as a complicating factor, and time of death consistent with the dark interval, the answer moved from working theory toward charge language. There's a community layer here that belongs in any responsible telling of a campus crime. Parents expect that dorm doors and desk logs create safe boundaries. Investigators leaned into those boundaries not as guarantees, but as measurement tools, to show, minute by minute, who had access and when. When prevention fails, precision is the closest thing to repair. By dawn, the file had a backbone, a secured dorm room, a fixed window of time, body as seen confirmation, preserved lobby video, a documented stop on I-90, and a recorded statement. The next step was translation, turning facts into a charge the law could carry. University police at SUNY Brockport led the campus scene. Monroe County Sheriff's investigators and the Monroe County District Attorney's Office assumed the homicide track. New York State Police handled the DeWitt contact and coordinated the Thruway Corridor. That division was practical, not political. Each agency owned a piece of the proof, and chain of custody had to read as one story when it reached a judge. Search authority came first. Detectives obtained judicial warrants for the dorm room re-entry, the seized hair implement and bedding, the visitor's phone, and the vehicle contact at DeWitt. Separate orders covered carrier call detail records and tower routing for the relevant hours. Subpoenas went to banks for tightly scoped financials, matching the procurement sweep you heard in the last chapter. Every return was logged on arrival, every item was barcoded and sealed for the county lab. Precision here isn't flair, it's insulation. A clean paper trail keeps later motions from eroding what the jury is allowed to hear. With physical, digital, and testimonial pillars aligned, prosecutors drafted the theory of the crime around New York Penal Law R12525-1. Murder in the second degree, intent to cause the death of another person, and causing that death. The elements map was straightforward. Cause of death confirmed as blunt force trauma. Proximity and access established by campus controls in the preserved room. Instrumentality supported by the morgue's correlation to an item within reach. Identity anchored by the recorded admission and the eastbound departure within hours. Where a defense might argue extreme emotional disturbance, prosecutors noted it for trial, not as a bar to indictment, but as a potential mitigation claim the jury could accept or reject. Grand jury presentation moved on a tight arc. Witnesses were selected to keep the narrative spare. The first responder to fix the welfare check entry, the lead crime scene technician for collection and continuity, the medical examiner for cause of death confirmation, the digital analyst for reconciled clocks and the DeWitt timeline, and an interrogations-trained detective to authenticate the recorded statement. Jurors heard clocks and custody before they heard conclusions. That order matters. When every independent time source agrees, argument gives way to measurement. Interagency summaries traveled with the file. SUNY Brockport provided certified desk logs and lobby video affidavits. State Police attached the DeWitt contact report and photographs. The county lab filed preliminary receipt notices for the hair implement, swabs, and clothing. When offices share evidence, they also share risk. The fix is clarity. Who collected, who sealed, who stored, and who opened under warrant. Any gap is a door for reasonable doubt. Here, the logs closed cleanly. Charging language stayed narrow. There was no speculative count for conspiracy or weapon possession because the evidence didn't support a weapon carried in from elsewhere. There was no attempt to plead down in advance of indictment. Prosecutors put forward exactly what the proof could bear: a single count of second-degree murder under KIA 125.251, with lesser included options preserved for the trial court's instruction stage. That strategy keeps a jury from wandering, one map, not three. Arraignment followed standard sequence. The court confirmed identity, advised the defendant of the charge, and scheduled further proceedings. Custody status would be addressed with full arguments at the next appearance and in written motions you'll hear about in the following chapter. Public statements were limited to the basics. The district attorney's office avoided commentary on motive and did not try the case in the press. In high-visibility campus homicides, restraint is policy, and smart. Behind the scenes, the prosecution team built a witness matrix and an exhibit plan. They flagged chain of custody signatories, scheduled lab analysts for foundational testimony, and began drafting stipulations to shorten trial days. Time sync of cameras to dispatch, authenticity of 911 recordings, and the existence of properly served carrier returns. Stipulations don't win trials, but they keep jurors focused on substance instead of process. There's a quiet human rule in charging decisions that rarely makes it to television. Don't overplead to force a bargain. Don't underplead and risk telling the family you blinked. In Brockport, a freshman died inside a room that should have kept her safe. The state chose clarity over theater. One count, one story, measured from clocks and custody, not speculation. With an indictment in place and discovery obligations flowing, the center of gravity shifts to what the jury will be permitted to hear and what it won't. That's where admissibility lives. With an indictment secured, the center of gravity shifted from collection to admissibility, what the jury could hear and what it could not. Pre-trial hearings began with the recorded statement. Defense challenged voluntariness and Miranda. Prosecutors walked the court through the advisement, the signed waiver, the recorded time in, time out, and the custody log documenting breaks. The judge found the statement admissible. The environment was controlled, the rights were read and understood, and no promises or threats were made. Next came motions to suppress items from McLean Hall and the DeWitt contact. Warrants, return inventories, and chain of custody seals were authenticated by the collectors themselves. The court ruled the searches lawful and the continuity adequate. Bail arguments were brief. Given the severity of the crime and the proof's strength, the defendant remained remanded. Discovery followed the same disciplined path. The state turned over raw lobby video, synchronized to dispatch time, desk logs, carrier call detail, and tower routing within the narrow window. The autopsy report identifying blunt force injuries, the campus collection sheets, and the digital reconciliation chart that matched the DeWitt contact to the eastbound departure. Stipulations pared down what needed live testimony, authenticity of the 911 audio, time sync methodology, and the service area documentation, so jurors could focus on substance rather than clerical foundation. When trial opened, the prosecution's theory was spare. Intent proved by injuries, access proved by campus controls, identity proved by the recorded admission, and the continuous route east within hours. The jury heard first from the initial responder who executed the welfare check and secured the room, then from the crime scene technician who logged the collection and sealed each item, then from the medical examiner who classified the death as homicide by blunt force trauma and described injuries consistent with hands and a heat-bearing hair device recovered inside the room. A digital analyst walked jurors through aligned clocks, final outward social at 12:13 a.m., dorm quiet, officers at the door just before 3 o'clock a.m., and the documented contact at the DeWitt service area within hours. Finally, the interrogation's trained detective authenticated the recorded statement and its timeline. The defense did not claim an intruder, a misidentification, or a break in the chain. Instead, they urged jurors to consider extreme emotional disturbance, a recognized New York doctrine that, if accepted, can reduce culpability, where a defendant acted under a powerful, reasonable loss of self-control. And in that argument speaks to why, not whether. Prosecutors returned to measurement. The room showed no forced entry, no ransack, no third-party trace beyond the two who signed in. The instruments of assault were within arm's reach and consistent with the injuries. The route east was documented not by speculation, but by a trooper's report and synchronized records. And the words were the defendant's, recorded in a controlled setting after advisement. Cross-examination pressed familiar pressure points, camera time drift, lobby angles missed, fatigue in a long interview. Each had already been tested in pretrial hearings. Technicians described the time sync method, auditors explained retention settings and blind spots, and the custody log showed breaks in duration. Where records were silent, the silence had been labeled as negative evidence from the start. No attempt to fill gaps with guesswork. Jurors heard from experts with narrowly drawn scopes. The medical examiner stayed within injury patterning and cause of death. There was no speculation about motive. A campus security supervisor explained access protocols without dramatizing them. The digital analyst confined testimony to call detail, tower routing, and camera synchronization appropriate to 2012. No GPS, no app telemetry, no features that did not exist in the record. When prosecutors rested, the file presented three pillars that matched and reinforced each other: physical, digital, and testimonial. In summation, the state kept to the elements of penal law, or 125 and TAW 1. Intent to cause death and causing that death. Intent was drawn from the injury set and the defendant's own description. Presence and identity were anchored to campus controls and the admission. The defense asked jurors to accept emotional disturbance as the lens for the night's escalation. The jury instructions made the legal road clear. If the state proved second-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt, the verdict was guilty. If jurors found extreme emotional disturbance had been established, they could return a mitigated verdict. After deliberation, the panel rejected mitigation. The verdict read guilty of murder in the second degree. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged the campus setting, the age of the victim, and the completeness of the proof. The sentence imposed was the one New York law has long recognized for this crime when intent is proved and mitigation is not. 25 years to life in state prison. Post-verdict, the court recorded credit for time served and issued the standard orders. Appeals were preserved as a matter of right, but the trial record, clocks, custody, and a recorded admission left little room to recast the core facts. There is a quiet, human moment that sits alongside the legal result. Dorm rooms are supposed to be first homes. the place where families say goodnight by phone and students set the next morning's alarm. When violence enters that space, the community asks for more than outrage. It asks for clarity. This file delivered clarity without spectacle, careful collection, lawful warrants, synchronized time, restrained expert testimony, and a verdict tied to evidence rather than rhetoric. Sharing these steps in public is not about reliving harm. It's about showing the standard that protects every future jury from noise. Safety on a campus is never a promise, it's a practice. Of signs in, of doors that close, of neighbors who take a welfare call seriously, of investigators who document rather than dramatize. If this story prompts one person to check on a friend sooner, to speak up when anger turns controlling, to treat dating violence as the emergency it is, then the telling serves a purpose beyond the record. Guilty. Sentenced to 25 years to life. I'm leaving this story with one lesson. Precision protects people. From the warrants we laid out into the measured verdict, clocks, custody, and facts, not noise, delivered justice for Alexandra. Dating violence is a public safety issue. If anger turns controlling, ask for help sooner, not later. After this campus crime, what should be strengthened first? Access logs, bystander training, or both? If this resonated, drop a comment with where you're watching from, or tell me why it didn't. And if you're new here, please subscribe to follow the next case.